Look down at your skillet for a second. That flat strip of raw bacon you just dropped in there is going to bend like a tiny drawbridge slamming shut. You probably blamed yourself the last time it happened. You shouldn't have. What you're watching is a mechanical failure written into the meat itself. A strip of bacon operates as an engineered composite of three distinct biological materials glued together, and they hate each other once the heat turns on. You're looking at muscle, fat, and the connective tissue that holds them together. All three of these layers react to applied heat on completely different, conflicting schedules. When you drop that composite material into a hot pan, you force all of those individual schedules to trigger simultaneously, creating violent structural stress across the strip. But if you map out exactly what's happening inside the meat, temperature by temperature, the curl stops being an inevitability. You stop guessing and you start controlling the physical geometry of the bacon. To understand the variables, we have to look at the baseline anatomy. Bacon comes from pork belly, which is a heavily layered cut. If you slice across it, you immediately see thick, pale stripes of solid fat tissue. Running parallel right next to those fat lanes are darker bands of lean muscle, and in between them, acting as an invisible architectural cling wrap, are thin sheets of collagen. This connective tissue webbing physically locks the fat and muscle layers to one another. Because these very different tissues are permanently bound together side by side, any change in the physical dimensions of one layer forces the adjacent layer to move with it. Your skillet operates as a thermodynamic testing environment where three interconnected materials are pushed into a three-way tug-of-war. Picture the raw strip sitting flat at room temperature. The fat is solid. The muscle fibers are soft and full of water. The collagen sheets between them are completely relaxed. Turn the burner on. Within seconds, you cross the first thermal inflection point, climbing into the 30 to 50 degrees Celsius range. This is where the lipids start to render. The solid fat cells liquefy into oil, causing the white lanes to steadily lose both physical mass and total volume. This initial mass loss happens in near silence. You are completely past this stage before the pan is even hot enough to produce a sizzle or brown the exterior. Meanwhile, the darker, lean muscle lanes remain structurally untouched at these temperatures, retaining their full original size. We already have a problem. The fat side is getting smaller, while the lean side hasn't moved. This unequal loss of volume sets a mechanical trap inside the meat long before the frying actually begins. As the pan keeps climbing, we hit the next thermal window, bridging 40 to 53 degrees Celsius. This triggers myosin denaturation. Myosin is the long, thread-like protein that does the heavy lifting inside raw muscle fibers. When thermal energy hits these chains, they unfold and rapidly retangle into a significantly tighter, stiffer structure. As this muscle matrix densifies, it forcefully expels its internal water. That's the pink weeping fluid you see starting to pool under the meat. Now we have two entirely different shrinkage factors happening simultaneously. The fat is losing volume by melting and softening. The muscle is losing volume by aggressively clenching and hardening. Because the lean side hardens as it shrinks, it becomes the dominant structural anchor in the strip. The softening fat side has no choice but to yield and go along for the ride. Now we progress into a highly critical 10-degree thermal window, 53 to 63 degrees Celsius. This is the domain of transverse shrinkage, driven entirely by the breakdown of collagen, that tough connective webbing we noted earlier. In this exact temperature range, the triple helix structure of the collagen unravels and then violently snaps shorter across the grain of the muscle. Because this connective tissue wraps every bundle of fibers, its contraction physically forces the entire strip of bacon to shorten across its width.
Remember the mechanical setup. The fat is fully softened and the muscle is dense. As the collagen shrinks the width, it pulls against the dense muscle, forcing the yielding fat outward. The entire strip bows inward toward the lean side. This specific 10-degree climb is the definitive moment the flat geometry of the meat fails and permanently warps into a curve. Finally, the heat pushes past 66 degrees, heading up to 80 degrees Celsius and beyond. Here, the final structural breakdown occurs inside the actin proteins. Actin is tougher than myosin, so it holds its shape at higher temperatures. But when the actin eventually collapses under the heat, it triggers longitudinal shrinkage. The muscle fibers forcefully contract end to end, pulling inward. First, transverse shrinkage pinched the strip's width. Now, longitudinal shrinkage shortens its overall length. The combination of these two axes of contraction locks the meat into a rigid, fully shrunken, three-dimensional cup. Pushing a pan past 66 degrees before the fat layers have properly rendered and stabilized guarantees you a warped, brittle piece of meat. There's an industrial variable we have to account for. If you've ever noticed that grocery store bacon curls far more aggressively than bacon straight from a butcher, it comes down to commercial manufacturing. Most modern bacon undergoes wet curing, where the pork belly is injected with a liquid brine solution to rapidly distribute flavor. This process forces 10 to 15% more water into the muscle matrix than naturally exists in the animal. When heavily hydrated meat hits a hot skillet, all that injected water has to flash evaporate. The rapid exit of moisture violently accelerates the muscle's densification and clenching phase. Traditional dry-cured bacon holds significantly less water. It undergoes a much less volatile evaporation phase, which allows it to stay remarkably flatter in the pan. The extreme curling you see in a home kitchen is the compounding effect of the natural protein ladder reacting to modern water-injected manufacturing. So we can apply these first principles to evaluate how we cook. Standard high-heat pan frying fails because of thermal velocity, the speed at which heat transfers from the pan into the meat. A high-heat environment forces lipid rendering, myosin denaturation, and collagen snapping to all trigger on top of each other, entirely compressing the timeline into under 90 seconds. Because the thermal velocity is so high, the muscle and collagen proteins snap tight before the fat layers have any time to fully render or stabilize their own structure. The result is a piece of meat with brittle, overcooked dry patches on the lean side, surrounded by ridges of soft, unrendered fat. Dropping bacon into a hot pan does not inherently make it crispier. It merely forces overlapping chemical transitions until the structure physically buckles. Chaotic, rapid heating guarantees this delicate, layered biological system will collapse under competing physical stresses. The practical solution is to actively manage that thermal velocity, allowing the meat to climb the protein ladder sequentially. This explains the exact thermodynamics behind the popular trick of starting bacon in a cold pan with a 1/4 inch of water. This chart maps the temperature climb. Without water, the heat spikes wildly, but the water acts as a precise thermal buffer. Because water boils at exactly 100 degrees Celsius, it physically locks the pan's ambient temperature. During this plateau, fat renders evenly, while muscle and collagen gently step through their contraction windows without fighting. By the time the water finally boils off and the actual frying begins, the worst of the chaotic structural shrinkage is already finished. Cooking meat is simply managing a complex biological system. By controlling the thermal load, you dictate the physical success of the final structure.